remember one day it was at, my mother said they declared war, and she was kind of upset and all this stuff, and it was the next year that I decided that I'm going to get called up anyhow, so that's when I went to YT to get in as a aero engine mechanic, because I figured I could use the trade, and that's the reason I went there.
Is the airframe as well as the engine?
Yeah, we had rigging, aero engine and rigging and instruments and everything. And we took drafting and covering aircraft skins and all this stuff.
And how long was that again, that training?
Oh, about six
six months.
Yeah.
And then you were sworn in, and at what point did they ship you to, it was Brandon, right?
Yeah, well, it was in November. About the middle of November, I got posted to Brandon.
And that was your first real posting.
And met Isabel up in the loft of the barn. The horses were down below, and we were up above, and that's where I met Isabel. And then I used to visit her fairly often after that. And then, well, one time I went to visit her in Winnipeg, and I was trying to screw up enough nerve to ask her if she wanted to get engaged, and we went. It was right at the station, and I was waiting on the train to go home, and I had 5 minutes, and I popped the question, and she said yes, and I ran and got on the train and got back to Brandon, and in the morning I found out I was posted to Pat Bay, so that's the last I've seen of Isabel for 4 or 5 months.
And Pat Bay is Vancouver Island.
Yeah. And then I was there a little while, and then all of a sudden somebody said, well, you got posted to overseas, you're going to India, and we couldn't figure out how they knew we were going to India when nobody else told us. And then after that was a bunch of inoculations and sore arms, and then I got 2 weeks embarkation leave and went back on the train to Regina and met my mother and dad and Isabel there, and said goodbye to mother and dad, and went with Isabel to Boulder, and we got married and had about 3 days in Winnipeg, and then I was on the train to go into Halifax, and was in Halifax in a day or two, and then got on the Aquitania, and was the first boat that went across the ocean without a convoy, and we had to zigzag. They changed course every 2 minutes, I think it was, all over the ocean, and it took us 7 days to get across, and landed at Glasgow, and then it was in the middle of the night. They put us on trucks, and we.
Can I just ask you a question? When you were on the ship for 7 days, did you get seasick?
No, not really. I got kind of woozy, but not seasick.
Did a lot of the fellas get sick for the first 2 or 3 days?
No, well, the fellas I was with, we were lucky. We got Joe to. My job was to sweep the deck after, and at night when you get out there, the wind would be howling in the rigging, and you'd look over at the stern, and it would almost go under the water, and then it would come back up, and
was
that kind of
pretty rough?
Yeah.
Waves were like 20, 30 feet, big swells, and
yeah. My chum, his job was to work in the mess and help with the feeding, and his job was to dish out the fruit, and then he thought, well, I'll be good to the guys, because the sugar was in the bottom, so he was stirring it all up, and the big long white worms came up, and he complained, and they took him away, and they still give the guys the fruit.
Really?
And we left England in the night, and in the morning we landed in Sardinia, a little island in the Mediterranean, and they gassed had to get the gas for the plane, and when we were circling around the island to land, you could see some sunken ships in the water where they'd got sunk, and then we land, and then old Mount Everest, it was smoking over the northeast, and then after we left.
That was Mount Etna, right?
Mount Etna, yeah. What did I say?
I think you said Everest, but that's just because I.
Mount Etna was smoking, and then after we gassed up, we left there in Tunisia, Tunis. We stopped, and it was in northern Africa, and we stayed there overnight. And it was hangars had bullet holes and stuff in them that would have been banged up pretty good. And then in the morning we left and flew across the north end of Africa and across to Alexandria and over towards Egypt, past the pyramids, and landed and stayed there overnight. And then the next morning we took off again, and we were flying past the Dead Sea, and the pilot pointed it out to us, and then we landed in Iraq, and then we just didn't do much flying because you had to have a permit to go across these countries, and then the next day we ran, and then the next day after that it was Karachi, and that's on the west side of India, and we stayed there for 3 or 4 days, and there was flies there like something else, and everybody got sick at the stomach, and had to run to the bathroom all the time, and MO's thing was one spoonful of Epsom salts and another spoonful of castor oil, both at the same time, and it worked. Shut the door and everything else.
And it worked for you?
Yeah, it worked good. And then we left there and flew to Gujarat, and Gujarat is in the Punjab, and it's in kind of the northwestern part of India, and there the 435 Squadron actually was started to get their aircraft, and then they stayed there for a while, and they learned, pilots were learning to fly them, and then we were doing parachute drops, showing and all this stuff, and then we were there 2 or 3 months, I guess, and then all of a sudden, I think it was the 22nd or 23rd of December, we went to the front, and it flew all the way across northern India and past the pyramids and all, or
the pyramid, or not the pyramids, Mount Everest?
Mount Everest.
The Himalayas.
Forgetting.
The Himalayas.
Himalaya Mountains, Mount Everest in the Himalaya Mountains.
And you saw Mount Everest?
Yeah.
Wow.
Pilots pointed it out to us, and then we landed at Imphal Valley, which is just a big valley right on the east side of India, right up against Burma. There's the Chin Hills is in between, and we were about 5 minutes from the front line when we were there.
And maybe just explain the front line at that point. That was Japanese.
Yeah.
And what was going on as far as the war was concerned right there at that point?
At the Imphal, the Japanese, that's as far as it was. The Japanese got to the Imphal Valley before they were stopped, and there was trenches there, and we went. Later on, we went looking around, and they'd see a trench, and then the trench would be the skeleton of a Japanese and a Canadian. It wouldn't be a Canadian; it'd be an Englishman.
Right.
Both would be in the same trench, so they must have had a bad time.
So you were in these trenches that had been actually used during the fighting, because now the Japanese had been pushed back.
Yeah, yeah, they were being. That was the start of the Japs being pushed back. Was then, our job was to. 435 Squadron was actually a transport squadron. We didn't have any armament on the plane, but it carried all the stuff that the 14th Army needed, and most of the time it was in the jungle and they couldn't land, so gasoline and stuff would be in a 45-gallon barrel and would have a cushion on the bottom of it and a parachute, and it would hook on the static line on the cable down the aircraft, and when the pilot wanted you to throw it out, you shoved it out and it went down to the troops, and they took them everything that way. Everything was food and everything. It was no aircraft could land because there was no place to land. So
there's no roads.
No, there was nothing.
No roads and no airports, except where you were quite low, flying low.
Oh yeah, the plane would the drop. They call them drop zones, DZ, and there would just be a little spot in the jungle, and when I was, most times the captain and the navigator would come back in the back, and I would help them, and we'd stack this rice up in the doorway of the plane while the co-pilot was flying it, and he'd be coming around in a tight vertical bank, and you could be walking up and down the aircraft, and you look out the door, and the ground would be straight below you at about 500 feet or something like that, and
didn't make you nervous.
Then when the doorway was full of when the co-pilot was in the right spot, he would turn on a green light, and you shoved everything out the door, and then you've done it all over again.
Were you scared at all when you were flying like that? Did you get scared flying like that?
No, I never.
Why wasn't it?
Oh, it was smooth. They had it trimmed so good that when I was flying it, it was just, you had to do is hang on the stick and push it down. They were coming into starting on their approach. There would be a way back, but he'd say, take it down at so many feet a minute and go on this heading, and I'd do that, and then he'd take it over just when we got to the airport.
So those were good airplanes to work on? Mechanically, they were good, solid aircraft?
Oh, yeah. I always used to compare the old Dakota to an old Model T. There was nothing to go wrong.
And they had...
We lost 3 aircraft with enemy fire. 3 got shot down, and 1 came back one time with a piece of tree in the tail plane. The only way he could get away from a Zero was to get down on the ground, and he came back with a tree in the tail plane, and it was close enough for him.
You said that was a 12-foot branch.
Yeah.
And the plane still flew.
Yeah.
They
flew. It was stuck in the tail plane.
Because they fly so low that they're actually clipping the trees.
One other plane got in a monsoon, and they had terrible updrafts or downdrafts, and when it came back, it had one wingtip was a foot higher than the other one, but the plane it was still serviceable and flew well. The old Dakota couldn't say enough for them. They were a tough aircraft. It was after they dropped the atomic bomb that we could.
So you were still over there when Hiroshima happened?
Yeah. If they hadn't have dropped that, we'd have been there for a long time. Well, I went home to Regina and got discharged, and then I went back to Isabel's home and stayed for the winter, and then in the spring I went home, and then we started farming.
So you and Dugald worked together?
Yeah. Farmed together for a while, and then we split up after a while.
Right. And the rest is history.
Yeah. The rest is history.
Yeah, well, no, we're glad you made it back, and we thank you very much for your years of service from 1940 until 1945 when you were discharged.
Yeah.